So I'm calling my talk today is Decolonizing Enough, Premodern Chinese Thought and the Challenges of Disciplinary Inclusion. So this talk is giving me the opportunity to think through some of the, I guess, responses or challenges or problems that I have been thinking about in respect to recent calls to decolonize the curriculum. And in general, of course, I support decolonization. I just don't think that it goes quite far enough for reasons that I'll explain in this talk. So I should note that my own personal background is not in political theory and it's not in post-colonial studies, although I've learned both of these bodies of scholarship along the way. But my first love, my first sort of disciplinary exposure to questions of decolonization actually comes from Chinese studies. And there was a very famous post-war American sinologist named Joseph Levinson, who published a series of books, a 3-volume work in the early 1960s called Confucian China and Its Modern Fate. And of course, in the 1960s, after the Second World War, during the Cold War, everyone was trying to understand why China had turned communist. And they were, of course, foraging in the Chinese past, trying to figure out, what went wrong. But along the way, a lot of really interesting and insightful commentary about the dominance of what we would call probably like Euro-American knowledge categories or something like that. A lot of really interesting commentary on this dominance was produced. And in my view, Joseph Levinson diagnosed the condition faced by supporters of the Chinese tradition most trenchantly when he pointed out that the trouble, of course, is that in traditional Chinese culture, there was nothing worth admiring. No suggestion could be more outlandish. To speak of a culture's modern transformation is not to deny the luster of its great past achievements, nor even the discovery of permanent truths in its past. It means only that a new generation finds it impossible to govern action by its own precedents, though the precedents may be honored, and that as traditionalists in these circumstances become more self-conscious, their commendation of past values seems ever less convincing. Now, admittedly, that's quite a fraught sentence, 3 sentences where he probably should have used 5 or 6 sentences to express that. But in any case, it basically means not that there wasn't something valuable in the Chinese past, but rather that it no longer guided action in the present. And I feel that this diagnosis was one of the most insightful challenges that it was one of the most insightful ways of posing the challenge that those of us who supported the idea of Chinese thought, who wanted to try to make it relevant and meaningful in our own time and place, faced, which is that it was a repository of ideas that had been consigned to a museum. In other words, it was no longer something that truly guided action. And for that, we turn to other kinds of discourses like human rights or liberty or freedom or entitlements or constitutions or any of a number of other things that dominated 20th century and 21st century political life. It was only later in graduate school that I encountered the work of Deepak Chakrabarty, who makes, of course, this famous claim in Provincializing Europe: it is no longer possible to think in the world without terms and categories whose origins go deep into the history of Europe. And it's this diagnosis, of course, that I think characterizes the post-colonial condition. How is it that we can think in the modern world? And of course, Deepak Chakrabarty and many post-colonial theorists like him argue that we cannot think outside of Europe, so we must renew European thought from the margins. And he goes about exploring what that might mean. So in between these two kinds of diagnoses, I try to, in my own work, I try to carve out a space for thinking about how it can be the case that in how we can think in the world, not necessarily without Europeanized terms and categories, but how is it possible? And if so, how can we think in using terms and categories whose genealogies, for example, go into the history of Sinophone literature, for example, China, right? Is that possible? Is that something that we want to do? It would have to be something we think is possible if we accept that something in pre-modern China has something to offer us. Right now, some people, many people, maybe some people, have argued that this is the case, that it's simply the reason we study European philosophy or political theory is precisely because it's superior, that it explains the modern world. But I think that's that's a certainly simplistic way of thinking about the intellectual history of ideas as a kind of marketplace where certain ideas win out and become superior to others. It's also the case, of course, that Euro-America is no longer the center of global power in any sense of that word, economic, political, military, that we have other sources of power, and many of them are located in East Asia. So it makes sense, even for the very practical reason of just trying to understand Chinese thought on its own terms. The problem being, of course, that at least in my field, what we get when we try to do this is we get the tendency is to kind of think about Chinese thought as a repository of items that we then sort of pick up, brush off, and put up on a shelf, where we say this is the Chinese equivalent of this, and this is the Chinese equivalent of justice, this is the Chinese equivalent of freedom, this is how we can talk about the Chinese state in relation to the European state. And what we have in this symbolic representation here are just a bunch of kind of discrete ideas or conversations that aren't joined up in any meaningful way. And because of that, it's very difficult for us to actually take account of Chinese ways of thinking, particularly in the pre-modern period. So by pre-modern, I mean pre-mid-19th century in the Chinese case. I think that pre-modern as a term has lots of problems, which we can talk about. But in any case, how can we move from this kind of this rarefied, cherry-picked kind of vision of what Chinese thought or non-Western thought has to offer Euro-American philosophy towards a more fundamental transformation or the development of a rival set of terms and categories that we can use to meaningfully and compellingly analyze political and social life, and maybe even articulate normative claims about it, right? I am all on board with this more radical transformation. I've called for it much of my work. However, even I have to admit that there's serious issues and difficulties with including Chinese thought. And I actually believe that these, although they may not be exclusive to Chinese thought, I think they do, taken together, make for a distinctive set of conditions under which Chinese thought has to be kind of incorporated. And taken together, they seem, if not insurmountable, at least requiring specialized, ongoing, multi-generational efforts to think about projects of inclusion in various disciplines, including philosophy and political theory. So I'm going to talk about what some of those dilemmas of inclusion might be for Chinese thought in particular, and then I'm going to pull out a few of them in my next few slides to talk about more specifically why I'm saying these things about Chinese thought. And along the way, as I mentioned at the beginning, I hope that I will be able to give you a very oversimplified bird's eye view of the Chinese textual tradition and what's distinctive about it. So Chinese thought is very much like, I call it an intellectual ecosystem, for lack of a better word. It's certainly not bounded, it's not impermeable. It's not even heavily policed as a category or body of thought, but it's contested and internally diverse, but it's also continuous and enduring. It actually has not been subject to that many ruptures of transmission for 2,500 years. So it's quite voluminous, much like an ecosystem. There are lots of different parts. There's lots of different kinds of conversations, but because of the material and historical conditions under which Sinophone discursive production took place, much of this intellectual ecosystem is internally self-referential and cumulative. So in other words, it makes it very difficult to understand something going on in the 16th century without already knowing what's gone on particularly in ancient texts, which are canonized and seen as classic texts that come up over and over and over again, but also how subsequent thinkers and interpreters in this commentarial tradition understood it and transmitted it, right? So it's quite difficult to start teaching or thinking about Chinese thought like in medias res. Actually, it's a bit easier to start thinking about it from the beginning and then move your way on up. But of course, this is incredibly overwhelming for, if you're teaching a 10-week course or even a 20-week course on Chinese political thought, this is well nigh impossible. But it's nevertheless full of allusions to classical and other kinds of texts that many of the people producing these works would have memorized in their childhood. So they don't use footnotes, but there are so many signals in the use of words and phrases that would indicate where ideas or concepts are coming from that their historical readers would have been aware of, but we in the present must sometimes struggle to figure out what the reference of these allusions is. And it requires deep conversance with dozens of key texts in the original Chinese, because if you're reading, most of this stuff hasn't been translated. And if you want to read new material in Chinese, you have to be familiar with phrases from the Confucian Analects or the Mencius, because these come up over and over and over again in different ways. And often these kinds of idiomatic phrases are used to make points that are sometimes subtle or ironic, and you have to be able to pick up the tone of these. One of the most interesting perspectives or characteristics of Chinese thought is that it assumes the legitimacy of rule by the emperor, with little discussion of freedom or equality. Now, there are some exceptions. Certainly in the 19th century and afterwards, there's lots of discussion of freedom, equality, democracy, and all of those good things. But in general, although there's lots of contested discussions about what a good emperor is and how the emperor's administration of the territory he governs might be implemented, there's really no serious interrogation of a rule by a singular emperor. So those are some of the characteristics which I will get to in the next few slides. But there's also the case that in teaching Chinese thought in the contemporary classroom, we face certain other kinds of political and other roadblocks. So Chinese thought tends to be seen as just sort of exotic and foreign, and almost overwhelmingly so by many UK students who would never have been exposed to anything like it. It isn't helped by the fact that, of course, many Chinese names have lots of X's and Q's in them because of the Pinyin romanization system that was implemented by in the PRC in the 1950s, which actually takes its transcription from the Cyrillic alphabet, not the Euro-American alphabets. In any case, it's seen as something strange and exotic, but it's also at the same time often seen as a source of politicized nationalism by students from the PRC. This doesn't happen so often, but I see it happening more and more. Many, not all, students from the PRC tend to want to claim Chinese thought as their own and claim to have a kind of specific or distinctive interpretation of Chinese thought, when in fact, of course, I see Chinese thought as a global heritage, obviously, and it makes for some awkward encounters in class when they're talking to a white American woman about Chinese thought. But one of the most distinctive historical features of Chinese thought is that it emerges from a very long, as I said, internally self-referential textual tradition that has no real deep experience with European colonialism. So unlike, for example, modern India, which is marked by British colonialism that has anglicized its academic knowledge production and has turned many of its standards, its academic standards of scholarship and scholarly excellence have been oriented towards that of Great Britain. China lacks this. China in the PRC, in the sense of the PRC, but also the broader Sinophone world, including Taiwan, it doesn't really have a long or deep typical experience with European colonialism. It has experience with other kinds of colonialisms, which I will mention in a minute, but it basically indicates right away that decolonizing approaches, which are very much designed to focus on and resist the kind of the colonizing effect of European imperial knowledge practices, may not work or may not be fully appropriate to what it is that the Chinese tradition tries to do. So let me just walk you through really quickly what I mean by contested, diverse, continuous, and enduring. And I tried to illustrate the diversity of the Chinese textual tradition by offering two examples here of Chinese texts. So the first one is it's an edition of the first chapter, the Analects, the Confucian Analects, which is a canonical classic text, maybe the canonical text of all canonical texts in the Chinese tradition. And you can see, of course, for those of you that don't know, just very basic, the writing proceeds from the upper right-hand corner down, and it goes from right to left, and we read from top to bottom. The big characters that you see in those lines, that's the text of the Analects, and then the smaller characters that follow them are commentaries written by subsequent historical interpreters. And it's very common. You'll note there's no punctuation. It's a woodblock print. I think this is a Qing Dynasty reproduction. And there's no punctuation in the text itself. So this is something you just have to learn to overcome in reading classical Chinese. And it's worth noting just briefly that classical Chinese is grammatically distinct from contemporary modern vernacular Chinese or Baihua. On the left, the picture there is of the COG, which is the Journey to the West, which is an edition that was prefaced by the Ming iconoclast Leigh. And Journey to the West is quite interesting for lots of different reasons. One, it's an example of vernacular literature, which historically, until the early modern period, was not valued as real literature in Chinese thought or philosophy, but then became very, very important as a site of new aesthetic sensibility and insight. Journey to the West also documents, of course, a journey to the West, which does not mean Euro-America, it means India. It documents the journey to India for the purposes of returning Indian Buddhist texts to China. And of course, the Buddhist tradition did play a huge role in Chinese thought and philosophy. So let me go now to the tiles on the left-hand side of the slide. This is my pathetic attempt to try to encapsulate everything that's distinctive about Chinese thought, why it's contested, diverse, continuous, and enduring. The earliest texts starting in 2500 BCE, these would be Shang Dynasty texts, archaeological finds, but there's no major long-term disruptions to transmission starting in about the 5th century BCE up until the present time. There was a huge flourishing of philosophical thought during what I think it's Karl Jaspers calls called the axial age. So this would have been contemporary with Plato and Aristotle, but in China there was a huge flourishing of incredibly diverse schools of thought. This is where people like Confucius, Lao-Tzu, Lord Shang, the legalists, Taoists, Confucianists were kind of coming out of. I don't know if you've heard of any of them. But one of the things that this flourishing of philosophical thought popularized, particularly in the Confucian school, was a commentarial tradition. Confucius famously says, "I transmit but do not create." And he was, of course, known for being a great editor and transmitter of even earlier classical texts. But it's often been the case that these commentarial traditions pictured in the right-hand image on the slide often function to promote original ideas. So often commentators would sort of quote a classic text and they would say, this is what this means. And the idea was that we're merely transmitting these ideas. But of course, if you read carefully, they are suggesting at times subtle and innovative ways of reading or situating the passage of the text. Much of our understanding of pre-modern Chinese thought is actually because of two ongoing large major editorial projects that were carried out first in the Han Dynasty in the 3rd century, and then in the Qing Dynasty, especially in the 18th century. I won't get into too much detail about these kinds of projects, but basically, I'm discovering more and more that much of Anglophone scholarship about the Chinese tradition is actually indebted to how Qing and Han scholars saw the eras that preceded them. And because of these editorial projects that packaged texts in certain ways and associated them with certain schools, but not with others, we end up having sometimes potted and inaccurate visions of previous bodies and schools of thought. So that's another quality or characteristic of this tradition. It's sort of unavoidable in a way because the tradition itself is so voluminous and expansive that if you didn't have some kind of editorial guidance through this enormous archive of materials, you would have no way of actually comprehending anything. It would just be too overwhelming. I mentioned already the influence of Buddhism, but also Islam, Nestorianism, all manner of other philosophies led to an embrace of syncretism at times, where people would try to practice. There were many Chinese Muslims, for example, who saw Islam as fundamentally compatible with Confucianism and would write very elaborate philosophical treatises, including commentaries on the Analects, where they interpreted them in a Muslim way and an Islamic way that was coherent with Quranic exegesis. But then there were also times where there were major political calls for exclusion, including sometimes violent exclusion, not only of non-Chinese philosophies, but also warring non-Confucian Chinese philosophies. The civil exam system was another unique, or at least distinctive institution that, in which, starting roughly in the Tang Dynasty, but probably earlier than that, in order to find work, the educated elites had to pass a civil exam because government service was their only outlet for a professional life. And the civil exam system requires the elite to memorize a set of classic texts. So whether or not they agreed with those texts or not, and of course, translation or the interpretations of these texts changed over time, they were nevertheless basically forced to memorize the same set. So you can imagine the way in which these kinds of texts would have played a role in the formulation of subsequent philosophies. The mainstream thought of these eras would range across a huge number of disciplines, including philosophy, art history, literature history, and linguistics. And this was only exacerbated in the early modern period, which is my focus of research, where the explosion of literacy and print media, which, by the way, was faster and of greater scope than in Europe because it was cheaper to print. The Chinese were printing on paper, which was cheap. They were using woodblock prints, which were cheap to produce, and one woodblock print, I think, could produce something like 24,000 print run copies, whereas in Europe, they were still using vellum, which was really expensive and hard to obtain. So, I mean, there was an explosion of literacy and print media in the early modern period. This is where we saw an explosion in the rise of interest in vernacular literature, as well as attention to non-elite forms of literary production. More and more people were capable of reading and writing. But it also meant that by that point, the textual tradition was so voluminous and being produced at such a rapid rate, kind of like the internet, actually. It was not capable to keep up. No one was capable of keeping up with like the massive explosion of texts that were being produced. And the tradition itself was kind of cracking under its own weight, to use the words of Andrew Plax. And this led to, in some cases, a total rejection of the canonical classic texts that had marked elite literary production for centuries. But those influences never really went away. And it's not possible to read any of this work without understanding them. Okay, so that's all I can think of for why the Chinese tradition is distinctive and unique. But you'll note that I also mentioned that the Chinese tradition they're teaching Chinese thought, particularly in the UK, can also be a source of what I call politicized nationalism. And this is in part due to the fact that in the 19th century, self-strengthening movements, Western learning movement sought to undermine traditional Chinese, the authority of traditional Chinese learning by arguing that mathematics and science from Europe and the United States, but also often via Japan, were more worthy of scholarly interest. 20th century cultural revolutions, there were a number of them, not just Mao's, but we had a number of cultural and literary revolutions in the early 19th century and early 20th century and mid 20th century that explicitly rejected the Chinese past and all of its so-called Confucian traditions. But this is another place in history where it turns out that what we in the present think about as the Chinese tradition actually takes a lot from these actually purely caricatured versions of the Chinese past that were rejected in these 20th century cultural revolutions. So this would be another moment in history where, unfortunately, a lot of what people take, particularly people working in political theory, political philosophy, claiming a Confucian way of life or something like Asian values, a lot of those very simplified essentialist ideas are actually coming out of what 20th century radicals were rejecting about the Chinese past. So this makes for some complicated and I think rather difficult conversations sometimes, not necessarily with students, but often with people working in the field who are trying to resuscitate a vision of Chinese thought as valuable. What their vision of Chinese thought is not historically accurate in any way. And then, of course, we have Xi Jinping, who is now the forever permanent leader of China, declaring Confucian thought as a key component of the Chinese century. And many people, intellectuals, public intellectuals in China and elsewhere, proclaiming certain Chinese ideas, including Tianxia, all under heaven, as alternative sinocentric visions of world order. We have a graduate student at the LSE, Max Afnan, who is working on these kinds of ideas in a more critical and cross-cultural way. But this kind of summarizes where the Chinese tradition stands, and I think it gives some explanation or background as to why I find decolonization being far too limiting a project to really take into account what's going on in that tradition. Now, I mentioned, just as a matter of pure historical fact, the Chinese mainland, we can argue about what the boundaries of China really are or what China actually is, but the mainland was never actually directly colonized by Europeans. It was certainly threatened. I'm not denying the very real imperial pressures and in some cases concessions that were made to European imperial powers in the 19th and 20th centuries on the Chinese mainland, but it was never actually fully colonized in the sense that, say, South Asia was. Now, the Japanese Empire, which people often forget was an empire, did annex the Northeast, and they also, as it turned out, colonized Taiwan. Taiwan is not a part of China. Don't believe what everybody tell you on that. It's not a part of China, but it was the first colony of the Japanese Empire, and it's now considered part of the Sinosphere. It's a Mandarin and Hakka and Minnan speaking, these are all Chinese dialects, Sinophone speaking area, but it was colonized by Japan. And Taiwan itself has an interesting colonial history, but it too was not marked by much European colonialism in the modern period. This means some of the consequences of this fact is not just that I'm not just making a simple historical claim, that decolonization doesn't work because China was never colonized, but it's because of the consequences that follow from that. So one of the biggest ones, I think, for people like us who are producing scholarship in political theory and philosophy is that Sinophone academia is still flourishing, which means that if you want to learn about Chinese thought, you actually have to learn Chinese, go to Chinese language conferences, read Chinese language scholarship, because it's a major center of academic knowledge production. You can't, and including in Japanese, which I don't read anymore because Japanese is really hard, but I read all the Chinese stuff. And this makes it actually quite difficult to get a grip. So not only are you reading, if you're reading pre-modern sources, they're in classical Chinese, but you also have to have a very strong grip on modern Chinese. There's also just simply a massive volume of pre-modern texts that are still circulating. That are still seen as relevant, that scholarship is still, they're still re-editing and producing and putting online and digitizing. And the volume of these things is just massive. So when people ask me questions about can you find me, the Chinese equivalent of Hobbes? It's not so much not being able to find something like that. It's just a question of, how do you make a choice among this huge volume of scholarship from the pre-modern era, and how do you sufficiently contextualize it because it's so complex and multi-layered, right? But this also complicates, maybe I'm being a little unfair here, but I say it complicates the post-colonial fixation on post-19th century ideas. A lot of what I've been reading, I mean, I get sent a lot of book proposals and manuscripts from journals that talk about decolonization, which is, as I said, it's a project I support, but these are overwhelming. Like the solution to decolonization is to reintroduce voices and perspectives that have been marginalized, often by European imperialism. But then this, perhaps inadvertently, usually ends up privileging 19th century, 20th century accounts that can actually speak back to and for the kinds of topics in political theory that were created by imperialism, right? Like state formation, constitutions, liberty, all of these discourses that found voice in and through European projects of annexation, colonialism, imperialism, and that also mark the preoccupations of contemporary philosophy and political theory. It kind of, I think it games the system a bit too much, so that when you're looking for responses to those specific kinds of post-colonial problems, you're going to be looking at certain voices rather than others, which doesn't mean those voices aren't important. But I think that it's time for us to think beyond the modern period and to think before it, non-modern, let's say, if we don't want to use the word pre-modern. More interestingly, though, in the Chinese case, perhaps because of the fact that there is a commitment since the time of Confucius to transmitting and not creating, and because there's such a massive volume of pre-modern texts that are still being circulated and read, quote unquote native methodologies are still practiced in certain disciplines. So precisely because the pre-modern Chinese textual tradition, whatever you want to call it, is so dense and internally self-referential, there are whole disciplines often identified with literature or linguistics that exist to navigate, explain, and analyze that literary tradition. And these are often picked up by Anglophone scholars researching things like historical phonology or linguistics or Chinese archaeology, where their indebtedness to especially early modern 17th, 18th century Qing dynasty scholarship on the textual tradition, which was preoccupied as it happened with verifying the authenticity of ancient texts, is relied upon quite heavily. And this is still certainly the case in certain corners of Chinese academia. When I say Chinese, I mean Chinese language academia. On the basis of these facts, I have argued in my own work, I will continue to argue, that it does remain possible to think using some concepts whose genealogies do not go deep into the heart of Europe. Now, admittedly, we're having to translate these terms into English. We're publishing them in English language academic journals, and that academia, of course, bears the marks of European imperialism. But I think it's a more interesting question to think about, well, how is it that we come to understand these differently situated traditions and ideas and the methodologies that supported them? And how is it that we can come to think as they do? So I've done a number of sort of articles, books on this, and I can refer you to them if you have further questions. But for now, I kind of want to impress upon you the fact that there is so much in the Chinese tradition that remains in circulation. And for that reason, I think it's a lot less colonized, and therefore its pre-modern traditions are much more vibrant and in existence than you might be led to believe, right? But precisely because China enjoyed such a flourishing cultural tradition for such a long period of time, we are faced with another kind of dilemma. China itself was the Ming and Qing dynasties, let's say, arguably other dynasties as well, but the Ming and Qing dynasties were dynasties of territorial expansion. They were, in other words, arguably empires. And as a result of that fact, they promoted a certain kind of cultural centrality that privileged certain voices and marginalized others. So in other words, China has its own subalterns. This is a picture, it says it's a picture of a horse, but actually you can see that there's actually a person there who I believe is a Mongolian. This is a Qing, I think it's a Qing portrait. I have all of the image credits at the end of my talk because I know that the talk will be recorded. But so you can sort of see, and there has been work done on the representation of non-Chinese others in Chinese dynastic representations like this one. And the fact of the matter is that often there was a certain kind of Confucian tradition of scholarship that was upheld not just as superior, but as itself constitutive of civilization itself, much like we had with the Euro-American, maybe liberal tradition or something like this, and that this existed in Chinese as well. So there are many such examples, but a few of them really strike to the heart of problems of decolonization. How is it that we decolonize not just our curriculum by including Chinese thought, which I've already tried to show is overwhelmingly difficult, not impossible, but overwhelmingly difficult. But also how might we think about decolonizing Chinese thought, if that's even appropriate. So what you see here is a Chu burial figurine. This is on display at the British Museum. Now, the Chu was a state in central China. Well, not in China. During the time of the Warring States and a critical formative period of Chinese thought philosophy, Chu was considered a barbarian state outside the cultural limits of the Zhou dynastic order. And the Zhou were sort of at the time of ancient China, they were kind of associated with, and they've since become associated with, and at the center of Chinese civilization. So not only in ancient China, at the time of its greatest philosophical flourishing, do we have archaeological evidence and literary evidence of profound so-called barbarian influence on Chinese philosophy like that from the Chu state. We also have the fact that China has its own legacy of indigenous people. And this is a 19th century picture that was taken in central Taiwan, where the indigenous islanders of Taiwan are related to Austronesian peoples in the South Pacific. You can see the skulls above the doorway there. We also have a tradition of Chinese travel writers going to Taiwan and southern China and writing about non-Han Chinese indigenous people. In certain ways, we have examples of the Ming and Qing states annexing territory and dealing with indigenous people of the Southwest and Taiwan in ways that, of course, profoundly exploited them. So how is it that we should understand these kinds of marginalizations, particularly when, in the Chinese case, there was no single reification or conceptualization of a project called imperialism. There was a number of things, a number of terms and policies that we might associate with imperialism, like opening up land, for example, or tax farming, or a number of other things, but these were not collected or seen or visualized as a single project. So how is it that we should think about decolonization in the Chinese context? How is it that we should appropriately acknowledge the marginalized voices that its own cultural tradition has left out of the conversation? Well, I don't know the answer to any of these questions. All I can give you is my own attempt to think about how I might start to chip away at some of these difficulties. And I wanted to share with you my strategy for teaching a course at the LSE called Chinese Political Thought, which some of you have taken or are taking at present. I'm looking at you, Julius and Nadia. So the reason that I actually teach Chinese political thought, and I focus it on ancient Chinese political thought, basically preaching texts, which are not the focus of my research. I do not have any special expertise in these texts, but because they were so germinal to later development of Chinese thought, it's a natural starting place for thinking about how Chinese thought can actually be comprehended, right? And it would be very difficult, in fact, to understand much of what subsequently passes for Chinese thought if you don't understand these germinal preaching ancient texts. But one of the benefits of doing this is that they actually do showcase profound diversity. So there isn't a single Chinese thought at all. It's just a series of debates among all of these different thinkers who refer as much to each other as to the past. So they're arguing and debating with each other. They're talking about the past and its precedents. They're arguing about whether we should use the past and how we should use the past and what its precedents actually mean for us. So in some ways, they're already working to expose the diversity and internal self-referentialism of Chinese thought without at the same time requiring students to know huge amounts of history and literature in order to, discern the incredibly refined classical allusions that are being made in these texts. It also happens that these texts exist in multiple English translations and have been written about a lot in English philosophy journals and political theory journals. So it's actually wonderful that there is more than one translation, because the biggest problem I would face actually teaching topics closer to my own research expertise is that I would have to translate all of the material. And I'm actually not that good at translating, and translating is a lot harder than anyone really thinks it is. I also use lectures. I actually rely on lectures a lot more heavily than I ever have for any other kind of teaching. Most of my teaching before I came to the LSE was seminar style teaching purely with very little lecture. But I find that using lectures helps break down the exoticism of the material and tries to relate it in ways that students, particularly students of political theory, might find useful. We also have cumulative essay assignments where we are always given the chance to revise and reflect on our opinions on these. Some of the strategies that I've used, we're getting down now to very practical strategies for teaching and pedagogy, but I see these as linked to the Decolonizing project, if only we accept that decolonizing involves a lot more than just focusing on the effects of European colonial domination. So I revised the syllabus to focus on concepts, whereas when I originally taught the course many years ago, I would focus on thinkers like Confucius, Mencius, Xunzi. But I realized that actually we should be talking about concepts and terms and ideas. And we have the last 2 weeks are dedicated to later historical debates. So it gives us students a brief taste of how these ideas have played out. I use kind of historically informed dilemmas to drive and examine students' intuition about these texts. I have a Confucian brain teaser that Julius probably remembers, which I did actually last week in my lecture on Confucius. That's actually derived from a real Ming Dynasty crisis of legitimacy, a ritual controversy that relates to how Confucius explains ritual, but I use it as a kind of a brain teasing example. I also encourage students to access their personal experience, thinking about these ideas as things that actually, because they are so focused on ethical and personal transformations and cultivations, they actually, oddly enough, are kind of political thought that you can use in the banal everyday processes of your own existence, which makes them exciting. And we also have debates where I get to pretend that I'm King Shen of Qi, and all of the students have to debate with each other about my policies. So lots of different strategies. But of course, there remain lingering questions, and this is my last slide. I have some thoughts about all of these questions, but I don't claim to have answered them, including how Chinese thought could be taught by non-experts. I'm not sure that it can or should, actually, which probably isn't the most popular opinion, but I don't really see any other way around it. How do we integrate non-philosophical questions in Chinese philosophy into debates in philosophy? Or is this an inappropriate expectation, right? Should we think about Chinese thought in its own terms, and rather than thinking about importing it into the constraints and categories of philosophy? And how do we reckon the status of Chinese thought within mainstream disciplines? I mentioned that it's an inherently multidisciplinary perspective. What do we do about that? And how do we take stock of it? How do we in political philosophy take stock of the fact that most of these people did not consider themselves political theorists? They thought of themselves as transmitters who are also always already involved in aesthetic production, literary production, not just philosophical knowledge production. So I leave you with those questions. I'm going to stop sharing and come back to, hopefully you'll have lots of questions. I think I've covered a lot of material, but it gives you a taste for what we face when we try to incorporate premodern traditions like the Chinese one.